In this video we will look at different ways to join granny squares together to make a blanket. Stay with me and I'll show you how. There are several methods of joining granny squares together. In this video I will show you three. These are single crochet, whip stitch and crochet as you go. I'll leave timestamps in the description for the start of each method. We will begin by single crocheting our squares together. This is called a double crochet in UK terminology. We put two of our squares aside for now, and we take two and we want to place the back sides together. You can see here the back of the work and how it's different from the front. The back's a bit more knobbly, and at the front you can see defined stitches. We place the two back sides together and we check to make sure the front of our work is facing us when we turn our work around. We take our hook and insert it into the chain spaces in the corners of both granny squares. We loop our yarn over the hook and pull it through, and we chain one. We insert our hook back into that same chain space and we make a single crochet. We then make single crochets into the tops of each of the neck stitches on both granny squares. Insert hook into the first stitch and into the corresponding stitch of the second square. And make a single crochet. Into the next stitch and the corresponding stitch of the other square, making a single crochet. Into the next stitch and the corresponding stitch, and make a single crochet. Now into the chain spaces of both squares, make a single crochet. Carry on along the rest of the row, putting the hook into the tops of the stitches of both squares and making single crochets. When we reach the chain spaces in the corner, we make a single crochet. Here's how the squares look joined together. You can see that the single crochet makes a little ridge. You can tug it to make it more centered. And that's how it looks from the back. Now we're going to join our next two squares, again making sure the back sides are facing together. Carrying straight on from our first set of squares, we insert our hook into the corner chain space of the second set of squares, making a single crochet. We need to make sure our tension is tight so there's no gap between the squares. We then carry on along the row, inserting our hook into the tops of the stitches on both squares and making single crochets. When we reach the chain space in the corner, we make one single crochet. We then cut our yarn and cast off. Here's how it looks so far. Now we need to join the squares the other way. We fold the squares with the back sides together. And once again, starting in the chain space in the corner, we loop our yarn over the hook, pull it through, we chain 1, and into that same chain space we make a single crochet. We carry on making single crochets into the tops of the squares until we reach the centre. When we reach the chain space in the corner, we make a single crochet, and then we want to get over the ridge in the middle, so we chain 1 and then move across to the next chain space in the next corner and make a single crochet. Carry on making single crochets into the tops of the stitches of both squares until you reach the end. And when you reach the corner, make a single crochet, cut your yarn and cast off. And that's how to join granny squares using a single crochet. Now let's look at the whip stitch. We thread a yarn needle with about an arm span of yarn, and we place our 2 squares with the wrong sides together. We start in the corner, the centre stitch of this chain 3, and place our needle into the stitch. We should have 2 loops above the needle and 1 below. And we insert the needle into the corresponding stitch on the second square. We pull the yarn through, leaving a short tail, and then sew back through those 2 stitches, locking the yarn in place. We'll now work from front to back, joining these 2 squares together. We place our needle into the next stitch, and then across to the corresponding stitch in the square behind, and pull the yarn through. Into the next stitch and the corresponding stitch of the square behind, and pull the yarn through. Into the next stitch and the corresponding stitch behind, and pull the yarn through. Into the next stitch and the stitch behind, and pull the yarn through. Keep working along the row, sewing front to back into the top of each of the stitches on both squares. When we reach the chain space in the corner, we whip stitch into the tops of the first 2 chain stitches on both squares. Now to secure our yarn, we sew down under the stitches, and sew back up again. We can then cut our yarn, and our first 2 squares are joined. You can join more squares together to make a long row, and then we'll whip stitch the rows together. To join 2 rows together, we hold the rows with the back sides facing each other, and starting in the corner, we put our needle into the centre stitch of the chain 3 and into the corresponding stitch of the square behind, and we pull our yarn through. Leaving a short tail, we sew back through those same 2 stitches and secure our yarn. We sew into the next stitch of the front square and the corresponding stitch of the back square and pull the yarn through, into the next stitch of the front square and the next stitch of the back square and pull the yarn through, into the next stitch of the front square and the next stitch of the back square and pull it through. Carry on making a whip stitch along the row until we come to the next square. When we reach our corner, we put a whip stitch into the top of the next 2 chain stitches. And then move across to the next corner, making whip stitches into the top of the next 2 chain stitches. Carry on putting whip stitches into the top of each stitch on both squares until you reach the end. At the end of the row, we join the squares by putting a whip stitch into the next 2 chain stitches. We then sew up and down through the stitches to secure the yarn, and we can then snip off the yarn. And that's how to join your squares with a whip stitch. Now let's look at the crochet as you go method, where we join the squares as we crochet the last round. First we will need 1 complete granny square, and we're going to join this second one. I've crocheted the first 3 sides, starting with 3 double crochets in the corner and ending the same way. Now we're going to join the squares in the corner to begin. A corner consists of 3 stitches, and we want to join in the middle stitch. So we take our incomplete square and we make a chain of 1 for the first stitch. Then for the second stitch, we take our complete square and we hold them with the 2 back sides together. We insert our hook into the chain space from back to front. We then yarn over and pull it through the chain space and the loop on the hook, making a slip stitch. We then make a chain of 1 and we complete our corner by putting 3 double crochets into that chain space. Now we come to where we would normally make a chain stitch, but here we're going to join to the chain space on the other square by inserting our hook back to front and then yarning over and pulling through, making a slip stitch. We then carry on to the next chain space of our incomplete square and make another set of 3 double crochets. And now we make another join by inserting our hook into the chain space of the complete square from back to front and make a slip stitch. And into the next chain space of our incomplete square we make a set of 3 double crochets. And into the next chain space of our complete square we insert our hook from back to front and we make a slip stitch. Into the next chain space of our incomplete square we make our set of 3 double crochets. And now we've reached our corner, so we make a chain of 1 for our first corner stitch. And into the corner chain space of our complete square we make a slip stitch and then another chain of 1 completing our corner. We complete the round by inserting our hook into the top of the chain 3 from the start of the round and making a slip stitch. We can then cut our yarn and cast off. And here's how the squares look joined together. Now let's join some more squares. Once again I've started in a corner and crocheted 3 sides of the square. Now we're going to chain 1 for the first of the 3 corner stitches, and we insert our hook into the next square from back to front and make a slip stitch, and complete the corner with another chain stitch. We then make 3 double crochets into that chain space of the incomplete square. We then make another join by making a slip stitch into the next chain space of the other square. We make 3 double crochets into the next chain space of our incomplete square. And make a slip stitch into the chain space of the square we're joining to. Carry on until you reach the next corner. For our next corner we make a chain of 1, and we insert our hook into that space where the previous corners are joined, and make a slip stitch, chain 1. We complete our round by making a slip stitch into the top of the chain 3 at the start of our row. We then cut our yarn and cast off. Now let's join our final square. For this last square I have only crocheted along 2 sides, as we're going to join it on 2 sides. We start as usual by making a chain stitch to begin our corner, and then we insert our hook from front to back into the corner of the next square, making a slip stitch. We then make another chain 1, and we make 3 double crochets into the next chain space of our incomplete square. We make a slip stitch into the next chain space of our other square, and 3 double crochets into the next chain space of our incomplete square. Carry on until you reach the next corner. When we reach the corner we make a chain of 1, and we insert our hook into the chain space diagonally across, and we join by making a slip stitch. We then make another chain of 1 and complete our corner by putting 3 double crochets into that same chain space on our incomplete square. And carry on along the round, joining each chain space with a slip stitch until you reach the corner. In our corner we make a chain of 1, and we join our last chain space with a slip stitch, make a chain of 1, and we insert our hook into the top of the chain 3 at the start of our row and make a slip stitch. Cut off our yarn and cast off. You can leave it as it is, or you can crochet a border around it. And that's how to join squares by crocheting as you go.